Hello, everybody. Welcome to Church at Home with Rachel for Thursday, the 17th of October. Glad to see you all here. Still processing last weekend, our journey of discovery, the first generation, and thinking about who we are and what we're called to do. I think I mentioned yesterday about the 94 calls to action that the Canadian government has called all parts of society, churches also, universities, everyone to participate in, and some of them are specific to churches about how can we make practical actions to recognize truth and begin the path of reconciliation with our Indigenous siblings. And while I'm not going to get into those calls of action that are specific to the church today, that's something I want to do within my diocese, within the church. I'd like to talk a little bit today about how we do that within our own lives, some of these calls to action. Some of them may indeed be calls to action that aren't listed very specifically. Many of them have to do with education. For instance, a couple of years ago, I was invited by the University of Calgary nursing department to go to Cold Lake, to their campus in Cold Lake, to speak to their new nursing students about truth and reconciliation, the 94 calls to action. And it was my privilege to do so. And many of those, they were all young women. Many of those young women were not aware. Some of them were Indigenous, some of them were from other parts of the world, and they weren't really aware of what we are being called to do. And that's why the school said, the 94 calls to action, one of them is that nursing and medical students are required to have learning about Indigenous history and all of these things. And so they had me come out and to talk about this. And I used the church's a video the church has provided. And we had some really good discussion about that. And what it helped me to see, and what really helped me to see this past weekend, is that those 94 calls to action are very specific calls to action for very specific parts of our communities. And they're excellent, they're necessary. But they are not the limit. There should be 1,094, 94,000 calls to action, actually. And they should be specific to us and how we are called to do this. And this past weekend, we did that with, I don't think we were necessarily thinking specifically in planning that we were answering the calls to action. I think it's just how we live in the Diocese of Brandon. That needs to change. We need to be intentional and able to name that we are living into our calls to action. And we will do that. That is my pledge to my diocese and my church, that we will begin to do that, not just by accident, not just because it's how we live our lives, but by naming it. But part of the way we did that was by having our four Sacred Hearts, the fire keepers, come and create a fire. I mentioned this yesterday in my video, that we had a fire was built and it was tended 24 hours a day. It was beautiful because, excuse me, Mackenzie, our camp coordinator, and CJ, our sous chef, Rob's helper in the kitchen, kept having to go with helpers and get more wood because at one point it looked like it was going to rain. And Tim, the lead firekeeper, told us that if it started to rain, we would need to build the fire bigger because they kept that fire, they were going to keep that fire going even in the pouring rain, which would mean the whole fire pit would need to be filled with wood. So they kept going and hauling the wood. It only rained a little bit, but they managed to keep that fire going from in the evening on Friday evening right and through till noon on Monday. The fire never went out. And think about that. For you, those of you who are campers, think about when you go camping, you go for the weekend or long weekend or something, and fire goes out at night, you restart later in the afternoon the next day, you have your hot dogs, things like that. This fire never went out, which means there were people awake and sitting with the fire every second from Friday evening until Monday at noon. It was never left untended. And Tim was talking to the youth and to those of us who aren't so young, who are gathered, but particularly to the youth, about what he was doing. He talked about opening a portal and inviting the spirits, those spirits who are walking the path on the other side, those spirits who are already have passed on, inviting them to come and gather at the fire. And I'm going to cry again, so here you go, because it's just that powerful. Having those spirits there at the fire, and the that's the fire keepers praying and owning this sense of the sacred during this whole camp, when the kids were all playing volleyball, and when they were drumming, and when they were goofing around, and when one of them was smoking in the boys' room and getting in trouble for it, and everybody sticking up for him, and everybody watching out for one another, and when they were teasing each other, and when they were angry, and when they were happy, and when they were sleeping the little bit of sleep they got, and when they were eating, and when they weren't going polar bear dipping in the lake because it was just too cold. For all of the moments that they were experiencing, there were people praying. And there was a real tangible sense that the spirits were present, that the portal was there. Every time we had a meal, the first fruits of that meal, so the very first thing that Rob and CJ would do was they would plate a meal. So if his breakfast would be eggs and sausage, and that meal would go out to with the fire keepers, and they would feed the fire with the meal, every meal. Incredible, isn't it? They were feeding the spirits who had gathered. And then at the end of the time, when it was time to close the portal to send the spirits back to the other world, the eternal world, they fed the fire one more time as a final meal to give the spirits strength for their journey home. The thing is that there were people present with us the whole weekend. Not just the dogs that were there for, 36 hours that I talked about yesterday, but there was a sense that there were spirits with us. There was an incredible sense of the thin place. Somebody commented yesterday on Facebook about the camp and that having been their thin place. That place where that which is now and that which comes after this, there's only a thin veil. It's like we can see and hear through it, sort of. And it's not so distant as we might think. And that fire was a thin place where the spirits who have gone before us came back to be with us. And they were in that fire. And they were celebrating with us. And they were praying for us. And they were comforting those who were hurting. One of the cookums of two of the kids died while we were there, and they found out. And to see those young men, because over this weekend they became young men. I saw them arrive as boys, and I saw them leave as young men. Seeing them hear the news that their cookum or their grandmother had died, and seeing them dealing with it totally differently. Brothers who completely had different relationships with her and relationships with each other, and how they were dealing with it, and how a couple of their close friends, some of them knew, who sort of gathered around the two of them and protected them all weekend as they worked through their feelings and they thought about things. And I had the gift of being able to talk to them about their cookum being close to them, that their cookum was very, very much, it felt very real that she was there at that fire. And this is the thing about those 94 calls of action, the 7 generations. The thinking, the teaching is that it took 7 generations to do the damage that we have done, that white people, settlers, colonizers, all of us have done, intentionally and non-intentionally. It took 7 generations to damage the indigenous peoples. And it will take 7 generations to rebuild relationships and to create a new path, a new way. But we have to start somewhere. And in very many ways, I believe that for us, for our people in the Diocese of Brandon, here in this part of the province of Manitoba, for each of these children, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, I believe that this past weekend was the first step, the first generation of 7 generations to come, in which we will do that work together. And Tim and the 4 Sacred Hearts, the fire keepers, they taught us, they gave us without being teaching, this is what you need to know, by just living their life, by sharing their stories, telling us about their own path, their own journeys, and then living in example what they believe and how they live and their witness, including one of them being baptized, choosing to be baptized at our final Eucharist. How powerful was that for the children, these young people, to see one of the 4 Sacred Hearts come forward to do this. It was incredible. But this, I believe, was the beginning of our first of 7 generations to really do this work. And it's not simply about giving back what has been taken. I think it's very much about teaching and learning what has not quite been forgotten, recovering those memories, but also sharing them with others, because I do not believe that those white Christians and our indigenous Christians are two separate groups. I very much believe, and the children are teaching me this, that we are all one. We are all creators. We are all the divine beings, children. And all of us have been given different ways of seeing the divine, of understanding Creator, of understanding eternity and the passing of souls and the passing of teachings. And those teachings are not contrary. They are not diametrically opposed, quite to the contrary to that. They are very much interlinked. They are very much intricate, and they have great integrity when they are held together. The teachings of the traditional Christian church are not so very different than the teachings of the traditions of the indigenous elders. They are speaking a universal truth, I believe, and we are going to discover, if we are intentional about it, we are going to discover the ways that we can bring those two things together, that we can learn that the next 7 generations of healing, of truth-telling and reconciling, are not necessarily about simply going backward and undoing what we did, but they are really about finding a new way forward and discovering and rediscovering who we have been, what the goodness of who we have been has been, and bringing those two things together. Because as much as colonizers did damage to the indigenous people, I think the colonizers did as much damage to their own people in the way we talk about our faith, in the way we reach out to one another, the way we've hurt one another, the way we talk about our church in this day and age. Maybe truth and reconciliation has to happen on our side as well. And I believe that true truth and reconciliation, true answering the calls of action, as many more 94 as there may indeed be the truth that Creator, God, Allah, Yahweh, however we speak to or speak of the divine. That truth and reconciliation, I think, needs to be more than simply the truth and reconciliation for one path. I think it needs to be truth and reconciliation for all paths. And we began that this past weekend, and we will begin this with intent in this diocese. And I believe that we will do it as a community as well. Have a great day, everybody. God bless you, and I will see you again tomorrow for Feel Good Friday. Hopefully I won't cry. Have a great day.